This video today is a follow-up video from the previous one, which was entitled Reassembly and First Fill. Now, in this little video, I'm just going to look at what the various adjustments are that you can make to the sort of outlet valve mechanism and what effect that they have on the power of your PCP, and how these adjustments work in relation to the regulator and what adjustments to the regulator themselves have on the power output of your PCP. So many makes and model of gun around the world are all slightly different, so we'll just try and have a brief look at those now. Now, on the FX rifles that we see imported into the UK and on the air arms that are manufactured here, you'll most likely know that they have a transfer port adjuster screw. And all this very simply is a screw that can be wound in or wound out to restrict or open up the transfer port. And so when it's screwed in and causes a restriction, the air doesn't flow so freely and the power goes down. When it's screwed out and the transfer port is fully open, the power goes up. On some PCPs you'll find that there isn't a screw thread at the back of the hammer spring to adjust the power, but the power on the PCP is actually adjusted by altering the length of the hammer itself. And so if you look at today's state and some Falcons and Titans, they've got a screw fitted into the front of the hammer and either a locking screw on the side or up the back. And the idea with this is, for finely tuning the power, is if the screw is fully out, then the hammer only has, say, 2mm to travel to strike the outlet valve, and so it doesn't contain much energy and it doesn't transfer that into the outlet valve. And then to put the power up, the screw is wound and locked right in, and then the hammer has 6 to 8mm or more travel to go before it strikes the end of the outlet valve, and so this transfers more power and lets more air out. So some of you will have hammers that are like that. Most of the guns that are about do have an adjuster screw on the back here to adjust the compression of the hammer spring itself. Some manufacturers, I think, just use packing shims, so there's a solid back plate, but then there's like washers that they insert just to pack the spring up more to get more compression. And this can be the same with the outlet valve spring. I know that some people have told me that on their particular gun in their country, the compression of this spring can be adjusted with a screw from where the spring seats down inside. Others say that it's just fixed, there's no adjustment at all, and others say that theirs has come with lots of little shim washers in, so you can remove shim washers or add shim washers to adjust the compression. So one of the rifles that's got the screw to adjust it is the air arms. On their brass firing pot you'll know that there's I think it's a M10 by 1 or M10 by 1.25 thread, something like that, and if you screw it in, it increases the compression on the spring, and obviously if you screw it out, it lessens off the compression on the spring. So that's those adjustments there. You've got the outlet valve compression on the spring, the hammer spring compression, length of the hammer, and restricting or unrestricting the transfer port. They're the main things that you're going to be using to balance your regulator. Now, the one spring that you've got to watch the most is the outlet valve spring. This is sort of the joker in the pack, and this is the one which will undoubtedly give you the most trouble. In general, adjustments to the compression of this spring need to be very, very small. And when I mean very, very small, if I put a 1.2mm thick washer into my Brocock Enigma, it will reduce the feet per second by around 170 feet per second, only within 1.2 millimeters of compression. And likewise, if you uncompress the spring, it has the same effect. You can move it a teeny amount and it alters the power a great deal. So the spring to be very careful with and make very small adjustments to is the outlet valve compression spring. Relative to that, you'd probably put 3 times as much adjustment on the hammer compression spring. So if moving this spring by 3 or 4 millimeters, compressing it by 3 or 4 millimeters more, would probably only have the same effect or less effect than packing or unpacking the outlet valve spring by a millimeter. There's a big discrepancy between the two, so this is the one that you need to be careful with. Now, what I should have mentioned to start with is, on all these things you need to keep a record of the adjustments you've made from graph to graph, otherwise you'll just end up chasing your tail. So try and keep notes as to the alterations you make to the compression of the springs, or the opening of the port, or the length of the hammer. Now, the thing that confuses people the most is, say you've put your regulator in and the gun is either over power or under power. So what you would tend to do is you would think it's a regulator problem. It's nothing at all to do with the regulator. And I'm not talking about our regulators, I'm talking about everybody's regulators. If there's enough air in this pocket, normally there's 5 times more air than you require. There's lots of power stored in this outlet valve chamber pocket. So it's nothing to do with the regulator. It's the balance of these springs and the transfer port and the hammer travel. This is the bit you need to be adjusting. And I say this because people will say, oh, I put the regulator in and it was under power. I turned the pressure on the regulator up by turning the adjuster screw out. It's lost even more power. Is the regulator broken? No. What happens is, if it's underpowered, but there's obviously a force of air pressing on the outlet valve, keeping it shut. If it's underpowered, and then you increase the pressure coming through the regulator, that pressure presses on the outlet valve, and so there's more force pressing on the outlet valve than there was before, and subsequently the power drops even more. Similarly, in reverse, if someone says, oh, the gun's a bit over power for what I want for the FT or whatever, I will turn the regulator down. They take it out, back the screw off and drop the pressure, but this in turn means that there is less pressure and force keeping this valve shut, and so the power goes up even more. And this is where people get themselves in a right tizwas and sort of lose faith with what they're doing. That's the first big mistake. Generally, you will not really have to adjust the pressure on the regulator much, and if you do, it is in combination with other adjustments. All these things need to be adjusted together. So in general, if you adjust the compression on the outlet valve spring, you'll have to adjust the one on the hammer spring a little bit, or you'll have to adjust the size of the transfer port or the hammer travel. They all need to be looked at as a whole and not individually. Out of all of them, if you said to me which ones are the ones that are most likely going to need to be adjusted, the spring tension that you're most likely, compression that you're most likely going to need to adjust is the outlet valve spring compression. And this in general on FT guns around the world where they're shooting between 10 and 18 foot-pounds energy depending on what country you're in, this generally the compression needs to be increased slightly. That's really the main thing. You would use the transfer port adjustment if you've got one for fine tuning, and then you can also use the hammer adjuster or packers also for fine tuning, although depending on what you're doing you might need to pack this spring up a hell of a lot more, but it's all got to be looked at as an overview. So you increase the outlet valve spring compression, the power goes down. You loosen the compression off, the power goes up. Likewise with the hammer, the shorter the distance of the travel of the hammer to hit the end of the outlet valve, the power goes down. The further the hammer travels, the power goes up. Likewise with the hammer spring, the more you compress it, the power goes up. The more you release the compression, the power comes down. And then the same with the transfer port. You back the screw off and open the port, power goes up. You screw it in, restricting the port, power goes down. Adjusting the output pressure of the regulator can put the power up or down, but it can put it up when you want it to go down, it can put it down when you want to go up. So the last thing you want to be adjusting really is the regulator, but we'll look at that all together and what adjustments to make in another video. But the main aim of the video is, and I will reiterate it for one last time, in general, leave the regulator alone. It can be used for some fine tuning later on. The bulk of the work is going to be fine tuning the outlet valve spring compression in balance to the hammer travel and the hammer spring compression. Especially this is the case obviously on guns where there's no transfer port adjustment. On guns, if you've got a transfer port adjustment, this can be used for very fine tuning at the last minute, but it's not really for major alterations up or down. It's really a fine tuning tool.